Can a ghost save your life? If you were in mortal danger, could love from beyond the grave be powerful enough to guide rescuers so they might arrive just in the nick of time? Jenny Grosbeck was driving with her 18-month-old daughter outside Salt Lake City on a cold March night in 2015. Tired and on painkillers, she lost control of the car, which flew down an embankment and flipped onto its roof in the middle of an icy, shallow river. No one had witnessed the accident. No one had any idea she and her daughter were upside down and inches above the dark, flowing water. Daylight was hours away. What's interesting about this amazing story is that the witnesses to the supernatural were the police responding to the call. Chad Grosbeck, Jenny's father, whose home she'd been coming from that night, jolted awake that morning with a feeling that something was wrong. He wanted to call his daughter and check on her, but he knew her phone was broken. So he hurried to his car and drove to her apartment in nearby Springville. When he didn't see her car, he felt sure his instincts were true, that something terrible had happened. From his daughter's home, he began to backtrack along the route she would drive from his own house the night before. Imagine yourself in that situation. The almost paralyzing feeling of something being terribly, terribly wrong. A feeling so powerful that you're scanning the sides of the road even though your daughter left your house many hours earlier. It's an irrational feeling. Odds are nothing has happened. And even if something has, she'd probably be at the hospital. And yet the feeling in your gut is just too strong to ignore. So you search the yards, the woods, and the ditches, all while a little voice keeps trying to reassure you that you're not going to find anything. Then you come across the flashing lights of a small army of police and rescue vehicles. A shiver sweeps across your flesh. Please don't be my daughter, you say. Please. Your eyes follow the direction of the activity. Your muscles are so clenched you can barely drive. Somehow you manage to pull alongside the rescue vehicles, and then you see it. Your daughter's red SUV, upside down in the river. Grosbeck scrambled from his car and pushed through the police barricade, fearing the worst. Jenny, the youngest of 5 children in a close-knit family, had dreams of becoming a medical assistant. She'd always been a very compassionate and caring person, so she relished the notion of a career helping others. Devin Trafney, the baby's father, called Jenny the love of his life. He and Jenny were not a couple at that time, but they maintained a warm relationship and they both doted on Lily, their 18-month-old daughter. Lily was the center of Jenny's life, and she made sure Lily grew up close to her aunts and uncles, and of course her grandparents. However, throughout the long night, Lily was hanging upside down, trapped in a baby seat, as a river flowed through the car right below her head. There's a history of ghostly forces intervening in the world of the living. If there is indeed a way of connecting to the hereafter, it must be very difficult to establish, very tenuous, very limited, since it is obviously incredibly rare. Maybe what makes such a connection occasionally possible is powerful emotion. For example, there are reports of murder victims helping from the great beyond to bring justice to their killers. In 1896 in Greenbrier, West Virginia, Zona Hester met a blacksmith named Aramis Shue. Perhaps it was love at first sight. Or maybe Zona, getting on in years, was desperate to start a family of her own. Or it's possible Shue, who had been married twice before, simply had a roguish charm that was hard to resist. Within months, the two were married and Zona soon became pregnant. However, the baby never arrived. The local doctor called to the home found the seemingly distraught husband holding the deceased body of his new wife. The good doctor concluded this was a clear case of death during childbirth. Zona was soon buried. But as she rotted within her final resting place, her mother, Mary Jane Hester, received a midnight visit by the restless ghost of her daughter. Zona wanted justice, claiming her husband had strangled her to death. After 4 such visits, Miss Hester took her information to the local prosecutor. She must have been gifted with rare powers of persuasion, or maybe she just wore him down because after several hours of convincing, he agreed to exhume the body. And sure enough, poor Zona had indeed been murdered. The court sentenced her husband to life. But when it comes to punching through the veil from the other side, probably there's no more effective way than love. Dolly Parton claims the ghost of her grandmother appeared in an airport and warned her not to get on a certain plane. Parton heeded the warning and switched flights. It saved her life, since the other plane crashed, killing everyone on board. Here's another provocative account. On Christmas Eve 2016, Jane Reynolds went to bed feeling uneasy. as though there was a strange presence in her house. In the middle of the night, an unknown force ripped her blanket off her bed and began shaking her. You can imagine her laying there frozen in terror. But then she heard banging and screaming from within the house, and she sprang into action, running to check on her infant boys in their room. Ethan slept soundly and silently, but 18-month-old George was turning blue, softly choking. She turned him over and patted him on the back till normal breathing returned. He was okay. Jane had arrived in the nick of time. But what force had alerted her and saved her child's life? We can speculate that a deceased loved one had helped her from beyond. But another theory, one that Jane herself has come to believe, involves a sympathetic ghost from the past. Neighbors told her 50 years earlier, the residents of the same house had suffered a similar tragedy. So perhaps the ghost of that unlucky mother felt moved to help save Jane's child. And there are other more speculative explanations beyond the possibility of ghosts, which are equally tantalizing. For example, the famous psychologist Carl Jung described archetypes that live within our subconscious minds, almost as separate identities. He also refers to a shadow within each of us, a kind of personality that embodies the thoughts and urges that we normally deny ourselves access to. Could Jane have been somehow aware at a very subconscious level of the danger to her child, but her conscious mind rejected this awareness, as we civilized humans tend to reject any awareness that seems impossible or irrational? Perhaps her shadow, desperate to somehow wake her up and rouse her to action, managed to escape long enough to pull her blankets off, shake her body, and produce a scream from within the boy's bedroom. Before we get back to Jenny and Lily, hanging upside down in the flipped over SUV, lying in a shallow, freezing river, there's one more interesting case I'd like to consider. In June of 1994, 23-year-old single mother Kristen Skubish was driving with her 3-year-old son Nick along Highway 50 in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. She'd recently earned her paralegal certification, was hopeful about marrying Nick's father, and was traveling to start a new life in Carson City, Nevada. On a particularly dangerous stretch of the highway known as Bullion Bend, Christine's car went off the road and down a steep embankment and into a ravine. The car was crushed. 2 days later, her stepfather called the police to file a missing persons report. The report went out to the highway patrol along the route to Carson City. Nothing had turned up. 3 days after that, 50-year-old Nevada resident Deborah Hoyt had an uneasy feeling that haunted her all day. Later that night, she and her husband were traveling along Highway 50 when suddenly Deborah saw a naked woman lying on the edge of the road. The woman was on her side, knees slightly bent, holding her head and facing Deborah inside the car. The Hoyts kept driving, not stopping, because something about the sight was so unusual that they became fearful. Was it someone playing a prank or even laying a trap to hijack their car? But they did pull into the next highway stop and use the phone booth to call the police. For those younger people watching this video, there were no cell phones in these ancient times, and we had glass booths containing phones that you dialed after inserting coins. Yeah. Well, the cops responded immediately, but they found nothing and left. However, the next morning, Deputy Rich Strasser remained troubled. He wondered if the report on his desk about the missing Christine Skubish might be connected to what Deborah Hoyt had been reported seeing. So he drove to Bullion Bend, knowing the dangerous history of that piece of road. Before long, he noticed a child's black tennis shoe on the side of the road. Looking down the steep embankment, he spotted the twisted remains of Christine's car. Climbing down the embankment, he found Christine dead inside the car. She died on impact. He went around to check on Nick, the 3-year-old son, expecting the worst. The boy was laying in the fetal position, but the deputy found a weak pulse. The boy was clinging to life. So what naked woman did Deborah Hoyt see on that lonely stretch of road right in this spot? Christine was fully clothed and dead behind the wheel. Years later, Nick, the 3-year-old toddler stuck in the car for 5 days with his dead mom, described what he remembered. He says a bright light surrounded their car after the accident as he laid in the ravine. Looking up, he saw the figure of a woman standing near the road above. He believes this was the ghost of his mother trying to flag down help from a passing car. If the young woman Miss Hoyt saw on the road was the ghost of Christine, why was she naked? Why was she laying unmoving on the side of the road? Perhaps the nakedness of the ghost represents the innocence of the dead mother, now stripped of all of her earthly possessions, the only thing remaining being her unyielding love for her son. And perhaps her spirit, so desperately reaching from beyond in hopes of saving her son, was running out of energy and slipping further away. Which brings us back to Jenny and Lily in the flipped over SUV. Sometime the next morning, a fisherman spotted the vehicle and called police. As the rescuers were sliding down the embankment toward the car, they heard frantic calls for help. As they got to the car, they all heard it, a voice from within begging for help. So the cops hurried as much as they could. The water was so cold that they later had to be treated for hypothermia. But these rescuers were determined to save whoever was calling them for help. Using all their strength, they lifted up the SUV just enough so they could get access to the interior. But no living being was inside that SUV. Jenny had died on impact, just like Christine had on Highway 50. She'd been dead for 14 hours. Lily was unconscious, in critical condition, and too young to call out for help anyway. Yet all the rescuers first arriving at the scene heard it. How might this be explained? One of the cops even responded to the voice out loud, promising, we're trying. Lily survived the tragedy, perhaps only by minutes. Doctors fear there might be brain damage from being upside down in the freezing conditions for 14 hours, but we're happy to report that that was not the case, and she was still thriving. Was her rescue aided by the ghost of her loving mother? Certainly her family believes this to be true, as does her father, who, driven by an inexplicable feeling of dread, went searching for her that morning. And to the hardened cops first on the scene, there's really no doubt what this was. No other possible explanations.